The day my father handed my brother a check for $500,000, he looked directly at me and said something I would never forget. Maybe if you'd made better choices in life, you'd be standing where your brother is today. Everyone laughed. My brother smiled, and my mother nodded in agreement. But sitting quietly in the corner, my grandfather never laughed. In fact, the look on his face told me something was very wrong. At the time, I thought that was the worst day of my life. I had no idea that 6 months later, one final letter from Grandpa would change everything and destroy the lies my family had spent years building. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I was never my father's favorite. That title belonged to my older brother, Ryan. Ryan could do no wrong. When he got a B in school, Dad celebrated. When I got an A, Dad asked why it wasn't an A+. When Ryan crashed Dad's truck at 17, it was an accident. When I forgot to take out the trash at 14, I was called irresponsible. It sounds small, but when you grow up like that, you start to understand your place in the family. Ryan was the son Dad wanted. I was simply the other one. My father owned a successful construction company. Nothing huge, but enough to make our family comfortable. By the time Ryan graduated college, Dad had already created a position for him in the company. A corner office, a company vehicle, a salary bigger than most people his age could dream of. Meanwhile, I decided to become a teacher. And according to Dad, that was my first major mistake. Teachers don't make money. He said it constantly. You had every opportunity to join the business. You chose mediocrity. No matter how many students I helped, no matter how much I loved my work, to Dad I was a disappointment. The funny thing is, Grandpa never agreed. My grandfather, Arthur Carter, had built the company from nothing before handing it to my father years earlier. He understood hard work. But unlike Dad, he believed success wasn't measured only by money. Whenever family gatherings became unbearable, Grandpa would quietly sit beside me. You know something, Danny? He once said, the people who chase money their whole lives usually end up discovering it wasn't what they really needed. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant, but eventually, I would, and so would everyone else. The favoritism became impossible to ignore when Ryan got married. Dad paid for everything. The venue, the honeymoon, the luxury apartment, everything. Nearly $200,000. When I married my wife Emma 2 years later, Dad gave us a toaster. A toaster. I wish I were joking. My mother actually laughed when she handed it to us. We know teachers don't need much. Everyone thought it was funny. Everyone except Grandpa. I still remember the way he stared at them that day. Silent. Watching. Always watching. But the real breaking point came 3 years later. At Dad's 60th birthday party. The night everything changed. More than 100 people attended. Business partners. Friends. Family. Everyone important to Dad. Near the end of the evening, Dad stood on stage holding a microphone. And then he made an announcement that shocked the entire room. Especially me. I've decided to reward Ryan for his dedication to the company. The crowd applauded. Ryan grinned. Then Dad pulled out a large envelope. Inside was a check. $500,000. The room erupted with cheers. My mother cried. Ryan hugged Dad. Cameras flashed everywhere. And then, Dad looked directly at me. A smile spread across his face. The kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all. Maybe this will inspire others in the family to make smarter career choices. The crowd laughed. My stomach dropped. Because everyone knew exactly who he meant. Me. Again. Always me. And as people laughed, I looked toward Grandpa. For the first time in my life, he looked angry. Not disappointed. Not sad. Angry. And that's when I noticed something strange. Grandpa slowly stood up, looked directly at my father, and quietly said 5 words. Words nobody understood at the time. "You've learned nothing, Michael." Then he walked out. And 6 months later, he died. But before he passed away, he left behind one final letter. A letter that would reveal a secret nobody saw coming. And when that letter was finally read, my father would realize something too late. Grandpa had been watching everything. For 6 months after Grandpa's funeral, the family barely spoke about him. At least not in front of me. Dad buried himself in work. Ryan spent money faster than most people could imagine. And Mom acted like nothing had changed. But I couldn't stop thinking about Grandpa's final words. "You've learned nothing, Michael." Why would he say that? Why walk out of the party like that? And why did he seem so disappointed? I didn't know. Not yet. But eventually, the answer would change everything. 3 months after Grandpa passed away, an official notice arrived. Arthur Carter's estate would finally be settled. The entire family was required to attend. Dad seemed excited. Ryan even more. After all, everyone assumed they already knew what would happen. Grandpa had built the company. Dad ran the company. Ryan would eventually inherit the company. Simple. Predictable. Done. At least, that's what they thought. The meeting took place in a large downtown law office. The Carter family sat around a polished conference table. Dad, Mom, Ryan, his wife, Emma and me, and finally, Mr. Whitmore, Grandpa's attorney. The man cleared his throat, opened a thick folder, and began reading. For the first 30 minutes, everything seemed normal. Several charitable donations, a few properties, investment accounts. Then came the important part. The company. Dad leaned forward confidently. Ryan smiled. Mom squeezed his hand. Everyone looked relaxed. Then Mr. Whitmore adjusted his glasses and read something nobody expected. Arthur Carter's ownership shares in Carter Construction shall not transfer to Michael Carter. Dad frowned. What? The attorney continued. Instead, all voting shares shall be placed into a trust. The room became silent. Dad looked confused. Ryan looked nervous. Mom blinked repeatedly. What trust? Dad asked. Mr. Whitmore calmly continued. The Arthur Carter Family Trust. Dad's face darkened. And who controls it? The attorney looked down at the document, then spoke 4 words. Words that changed the atmosphere instantly. Daniel Carter controls it. The room exploded. What? Ryan nearly stood up. Dad looked like he'd been punched. Mom gasped. Even Emma froze. I couldn't speak. Surely, I had heard him wrong. But I hadn't. The attorney repeated himself. Daniel Carter has been appointed sole trustee and voting controller. Dad slammed his hand onto the table. This is ridiculous. There must be some mistake. There is no mistake. Mr. Whitmore replied calmly. Ryan looked pale. But Daniel doesn't even work for the company. Dad turned toward me. For the first time in years, I had his complete attention. And he hated it. Did you know about this? No. I answered honestly. Dad looked furious. Ryan looked terrified. Because suddenly, the golden future he'd always expected wasn't guaranteed anymore. And then things got even worse. Mr. Whitmore wasn't finished. Not even close. He opened another folder and slowly pulled out a sealed envelope. Grandpa's attorney. The man cleared his throat, opened a thick folder, and began reading. For the first 30 minutes, everything seemed normal. Several charitable donations, a few properties, investment accounts. Then came the important part. The company. Dad leaned forward confidently. Ryan smiled. Mom squeezed his hand. Everyone looked relaxed. Then Mr. Whitmore adjusted his glasses and read something nobody expected. Arthur Carter's ownership shares in Carter Construction shall not transfer to Michael Carter. Dad frowned. What? The attorney continued. Instead, all voting shares shall be placed into a trust. The room became silent. Dad looked confused. Ryan looked nervous. Mom blinked repeatedly. What trust? Dad asked. Mr. Whitmore calmly continued. The Arthur Carter Family Trust. Dad's face darkened. And who controls it? The attorney looked down at the document, then spoke 4 words. Words that changed the atmosphere instantly. Daniel Carter controls it. The room exploded. What? Ryan nearly stood up. Dad looked like he'd been punched. Mom gasped. Even Emma froze. I couldn't speak. Surely. I had heard him wrong. But I hadn't. The attorney repeated himself. Daniel Carter has been appointed sole trustee and voting controller. Dad slammed his hand onto the table. This is ridiculous. There must be some mistake. There is no mistake. Mr. Whitmore replied calmly. Ryan looked pale. But Daniel doesn't even work for the company. Dad turned toward me. For the first time in years, I had his complete attention. And he hated it. Did you know about this? No. I answered honestly. Dad looked furious. Ryan looked terrified. Because suddenly, the golden future he'd always expected wasn't guaranteed anymore. And then things got even worse. Mr. Whitmore wasn't finished. Not even close. He opened another folder and slowly pulled out a sealed envelope. And for the first time in my life, nobody was looking at Ryan. Everyone was looking at me. But Grandpa wasn't finished. Because the next revelation would be even bigger. And when it came out, Dad would realize that losing control of the company was only the beginning. Nobody spoke. Not after hearing Grandpa's words. Not after learning that the grandson he was proudest of was me. For the first time in my life, Ryan wasn't the center of attention. And judging by the look on his face, he hated it. Dad sat frozen. His jaw clenched. His hands trembling slightly. Because Grandpa had just done something no one thought possible. He had publicly challenged the story Dad had spent decades creating. The story that Ryan was the success. And I was the disappointment. But the biggest shock was still coming. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat. Then unfolded a second page. I was instructed to continue. The room immediately became tense. Dad looked exhausted. Ryan looked terrified. And somehow, I knew this wasn't about praise anymore. This was about consequences. The attorney began reading again. Daniel, if you're hearing this, then I've run out of time. I wish I could tell you these things in person. But some lessons are only understood after we're gone. My chest tightened. Because suddenly, this wasn't a legal meeting. This was Grandpa talking directly to me. The attorney continued. For years I watched you work harder than anyone in this family. I watched you help people who could do nothing for you. I watched you choose character over profit. And I watched others mistake kindness for weakness. Dad lowered his eyes. Mom quietly cried. Ryan stared at the table. Then came the sentence nobody expected. Which is why I made another decision. The room froze. Another decision? Dad looked up. What does that mean? Mr. Whitmore ignored him and continued reading. The trust controls the company. But that isn't the true inheritance. Everyone looked confused. Even me. Then the attorney opened a final folder. A thick one. Much thicker than all the others. My stomach dropped. Because suddenly, the room felt very small. Mr. Whitmore smiled. Arthur requested this be revealed separately. Ryan whispered. Revealed what? The attorney looked directly at me, then spoke. 2 years ago, Arthur Carter quietly sold several private investments. Dad frowned. Ryan looked confused. Mom stopped crying. And then the number came out. The number that changed everything. The total value of those investments was approximately $42 million. The room exploded. What? Ryan jumped to his feet. Dad nearly fell back in his chair. Mom looked like she couldn't breathe. $42 million. Even hearing it felt unreal. But then came the real bombshell. The funds were placed into a private family foundation. Ryan interrupted. Okay, but who owns it? The attorney calmly replied. Daniel Carter. Silence. Complete silence. I couldn't move. Couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. Dad stared at me. Ryan looked ready to collapse. And Mom simply whispered, no. But yes, it was true. Grandpa had left me control of a foundation worth more money than anyone in the family imagined. And suddenly, everything Dad had spent years worshipping belonged to the son he never valued. New suspense. But what happened next shocked me even more. Because Ryan suddenly stood up. And for the first time in his life, the mask came off. Completely. The real Ryan finally appeared. And what he said next destroyed whatever remained of our family. Ryan slammed both hands onto the table. This is insane. Dad tried to calm him. Ryan. No. Ryan shouted. No. I spent 15 years working for that company. I earned this. The room froze. Because nobody had ever heard Ryan speak that way before. Especially not to Dad. But Ryan wasn't finished. He pointed directly at me. Him. Seriously. He's a school teacher. He teaches kids. What does he know about business? The words echoed through the room. And suddenly, I wasn't hearing Ryan anymore. I was hearing Dad. The same insults. The same attitude. The same belief that money determined value. Because Ryan had learned it from somewhere. Dad looked horrified. As if hearing his own beliefs spoken out loud sounded different somehow. Ugly. Embarrassing. True. Then Ryan made a mistake. A huge mistake. He laughed. Actually laughed. And said something that made even the attorney uncomfortable. Grandpa was old. He clearly wasn't thinking straight. The room went silent. Dead silent. Mr. Whitmore slowly removed another document. And quietly said, Arthur expected that reaction. Ryan stopped smiling. The attorney continued. Which is why he left instructions regarding Ryan Carter specifically. Ryan's face drained of color. What instructions? The attorney opened the document. And smiled sadly. Instructions based on information Arthur privately investigated before his death. Suddenly, Dad looked nervous. Very nervous. Because whatever Grandpa had discovered, it was serious. Very serious. And when the truth finally came out, Ryan would lose far more than an inheritance. He would lose everything. The room felt suffocating. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because the moment Grandpa's attorney mentioned a private investigation, everyone looked at Ryan, including Dad. For the first time in years, Dad wasn't looking at Ryan with pride. He was looking at him with concern. Real concern. Ryan forced a laugh. This is ridiculous. What investigation? Mr. Whitmore calmly opened another folder, one much thinner than the others, but somehow far more dangerous. The attorney adjusted his glasses, then looked directly at Ryan. Arthur Carter hired forensic accountants 18 months ago. Ryan's smile vanished. Dad frowned. What for? The attorney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled out several printed reports, bank statements, expense records, corporate transfers, and suddenly, Ryan stopped looking confident because he recognized them. Immediately, new suspense. And that's when I realized something. Grandpa hadn't just been watching. He had been preparing. For years. The attorney placed the documents on the table, then quietly said, "The investigation discovered unauthorized company spending." Dad's face darkened. Unauthorized spending? Ryan swallowed hard. His hands were shaking now. The attorney nodded. Luxury vacations, private memberships, vehicle purchases, entertainment expenses, all charged to Carter Construction. The room became silent, because everyone understood exactly what that meant. Ryan immediately stood up. Those were business expenses. The attorney calmly replied, "No, they weren't." Another document appeared, then another, each worse than the last. A sports car, a luxury watch collection, a beach house rental, thousands of dollars spent every month. Dad's face had turned completely white, because the total amount sat clearly at the bottom of the report. $1.8 million. Gone. Ryan looked like he might faint. Mom covered her mouth. No. Dad slowly turned toward his son. Tell me this isn't true. Ryan couldn't answer. And that silence told everyone everything. For years, while Dad praised him as the perfect son, Ryan had been quietly stealing from the company. Not enough to get caught immediately, but enough to enrich himself. Enough for Grandpa to notice. And once Grandpa noticed, he started digging. The attorney continued. Arthur discovered the discrepancies approximately 18 months before his death. Ryan whispered. He had no right. The room froze. No right? Dad stared at him in disbelief. You stole from the company. Ryan shook his head. I deserved it. And suddenly, everything made sense. The expensive vacations, the luxury lifestyle, the endless bragging. Ryan hadn't earned any of it. He'd simply been taking it. Because nobody ever told him no. Not Dad. Not Mom. Nobody. Grandpa was the only person willing to see the truth. And now, that truth was destroying everything. New suspense. But the biggest shock wasn't the missing money. Not even close. Because Grandpa had discovered something even worse. Something that would completely destroy Ryan's future. And when the attorney revealed it, even Dad looked sick. Mr. Whitmore slowly opened the final page. Then sighed. Unfortunately, the financial misconduct wasn't the only concern. Ryan immediately looked terrified. For the first time all day. Real fear. The attorney continued. Arthur also learned that Ryan had been negotiating the sale of company assets without authorization. Dad nearly jumped out of his chair. What? Mom gasped. I stared in disbelief. The attorney nodded. There is documented evidence. Then he handed over emails, printed contracts, meeting records, everything. Dad grabbed the papers, his hands trembling violently. The more he read, the worse his expression became. Finally he looked up and whispered, You were trying to sell company property? Ryan didn't answer, because he couldn't. The evidence was overwhelming. The room fell silent. the golden child, the future heir, the son Dad had always chosen over me, had nearly destroyed the company, and Grandpa knew it. That's why he created the trust. That's why he gave me control. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he wanted to save what he'd spent a lifetime building. Dad slowly sat back down, looking 20 years older. For the first time, he understood. The wrong son had been trusted. The wrong son had been rewarded. And the wrong son had been chosen. But Grandpa's final lesson wasn't finished yet, because hidden inside the last envelope was one final message, a message written specifically for Dad. And after hearing it, he would break down in front of everyone. For the first time in his life, nobody spoke. Not after the truth about Ryan. Not after learning that Grandpa had spent years quietly investigating. And certainly not after discovering that the son Dad trusted most had nearly destroyed the company. Dad sat motionless, staring at the table. The same table where he'd spent years praising Ryan, defending Ryan, choosing Ryan. Now all he could do was look at the evidence and wonder how he had missed it. The answer was simple. Because he never wanted to see it. The attorney waited patiently, then reached for one final envelope. The last one. The envelope Grandpa had marked. For Michael only. Dad looked at it, his hands shaking. Slowly, he opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Only one page. One final message from the man who built everything. The room became silent, and Dad began reading. First, nobody could hear him. Then his voice grew louder. Michael, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I know you're angry, and I know you probably think I've been unfair. Dad swallowed hard. The room remained silent. Then he continued. But this isn't about punishment. It's about consequences. Ryan lowered his head. Mom quietly cried. And Dad kept reading. For years, I watched you repeat a mistake that destroys families. You confused achievement with character. You rewarded success, but ignored integrity. Dad's voice cracked, because everyone knew Grandpa was right. Then came the sentence that shattered him. The greatest disappointment of my life wasn't Ryan. It was watching you become the kind of father I tried so hard not to be. Dad stopped reading. The room froze. Even Ryan looked shocked, because Grandpa had never spoken to Dad that way. Not once. Dad wiped his eyes, then continued. You spent years teaching one son he was superior, and teaching the other son he wasn't enough. You hurt both of them. The words hit like a hammer, because suddenly, this wasn't just about me. Ryan was damaged too, in a different way. Dad looked broken, completely broken. Then he read Grandpa's final paragraph. The greatest inheritance I leave behind isn't money. It's a chance. A chance for you to become a better father than you've been. Whether you take that chance is up to you. The letter ended, and for several seconds, nobody moved. Then something happened that I never expected. My father cried. Not quietly, not politely. He broke. Completely. The man I'd spent 32 years trying to impress finally saw himself clearly, and he hated what he saw. New suspense. But then something happened nobody expected. Ryan stood up, and what he said next shocked the entire room, because for the first time in his life, he stopped blaming everyone else. Ryan looked exhausted, defeated, like someone waking from a very long dream. Slowly, he looked toward me, then toward Dad, and finally said, I didn't think he'd find out. The room froze. Dad looked up. Ryan continued, I kept telling myself I'd pay it back. I kept telling myself I deserved more. His voice cracked. But eventually, I stopped caring. Nobody interrupted. Nobody defended him. Because there was nothing left to defend. Ryan wiped his eyes, then looked at me, and quietly said, "I'm sorry." I stared at him, unsure what to say, because this was the first genuine apology I'd ever heard from him. Then he looked at Dad, and said something even harder. "You made me believe I could do no wrong." Dad broke down again, because deep down, he knew that was true. For years, every mistake had been excused, every bad decision defended, every warning ignored, until there were consequences, real consequences. The attorney eventually cleared his throat. "There is one final matter." Everyone looked up. "The trust becomes fully active immediately." Dad nodded slowly. He already knew what that meant. Control belonged to me now. Not Ryan. Not him. Me. The son nobody believed in. The son nobody chose. The son Grandpa trusted. And for the first time in my life, I realized something. I didn't need Dad's approval anymore. I never had. 6 months later. 6 months later. A lot had changed. Ryan resigned from the company. He entered financial counseling, sold most of his luxury assets, and started rebuilding his life from scratch. Dad stepped back from daily operations. For the first time ever, he actually listened instead of talking, and our relationship slowly began to heal. Not overnight, not magically, but honestly, one conversation at a time, one apology at a time, one effort at a time. As for me, I remained a teacher. That surprised everyone, including Dad. One afternoon he asked why. "You could do anything now." I smiled, then gave him the same answer Grandpa once gave me. "Success isn't measured only by money." Dad laughed softly, then nodded, because finally, he understood. A year later, we placed a plaque in the company lobby, just beneath Grandpa's portrait. It contained a quote from his final letter, a quote every employee would see, every single day. It read, "Character is revealed by how you treat the people who can do nothing for you." And every time I walked past it, I remembered something important. Grandpa didn't leave me his fortune because I was the smartest, or the richest, or the most successful. He left it to me because he trusted me. And in the end, trust turned out to be worth far more than $500,000. Far more than a company. Far more than money itself. Because while my father spent years choosing one son over the other, Grandpa saw something nobody else did. And when he had the last word, everything changed. The end.